The first time I remember feeling out of touch about a meme was when I first started seeing the "We Live in a Society" Joker meme come up and assumed it was a riff on Seinfeld, when the meme was made by people younger than me who had probably never seen Seinfeld.
You know, we're living in a society. We're supposed to act in a civilized way.
The Know Your Meme page for Gamer Joker does make reference to Seinfeld, but makes the linkage unclear. That page traces the origin of the meme back to 2015, though taking a few years to ferment and emerging as the recognizable series of image macros by about 2017. The unclear link gels well with the unclear content of the memes, which lived in that edgelord zone of maybe satire, maybe not, that were all the rage back then, and like many memes of the mid to late 10s, started to take on a life of their own, a new lease on the Joker as a character. I'm left below, and we live in a society where small YouTubers like me need you to like, subscribe, and leave a comment after the video if we're to achieve breakthrough. Like my last video from a year ago, this one has some intersection with a recent FD Signifier video about edgelord movies, which I'll link below. It also has intersection with a more recent Jack Saint video. Hey, took me a while to make this one. Likewise linked. I'd still recommend watching it because his video covers other series too and is about the relationship between artists with edgelord fan bases and those fans themselves. Instead, I'm here to humor the meme's interpretation. What does the modern interpretation of the Joker have to say about society and about political change? The memes themselves don't have much to say on this front, mainly because they don't have much to do with the Joker. The memes are Gamer Joker and fit more in with the Gamers Rise Up concept.
So I was on Reddit and I saw a meme that said, "Gamers Rise Up." I commented, "Gamers Rise Up? Only thing I've seen Gamers Rise Up for is another bag of Cheetos." Yeah, I got downvoted there too.
But the Gamers Rise Up concept fits in with one of the big ideas to come out of the manosphere, called the Sigma male, which sadly has nothing to do with the Omegaverse, but is still tied into that misinterpretation of Rudolf Schenkel's old study of captive wolves in trying to categorize men into a rigid hierarchy, mostly. The Sigmas are the ones who aren't supposed to fit in, but as opposed to the Omegas at the bottom of the pile, the Sigmas are unconcerned about their lack of status in the hierarchy and chart their own course in life. Joker is a more extreme example of the many Sigma male heroes of TV and movies this century, like Tony Soprano or Walter White. Anti-heroes or outright villain protagonists who are not champions of their worlds, but instead refuse to submit to the terms presented to them. Further examples in the FD Signifier video. The best parallel I can think of for modern Joker comes from, weirdly enough, a Joel Schumacher movie from a little further back called Falling Down. And this one is covered in an even older FD Signifier video if you haven't heard of it. The movie is also a pretty good watch on its own. For a short summary, the main character of William Foster is a put-upon defense contractor, divorced and estranged from his wife and child and stuck in traffic on a hot day, who decides he's had enough, leaves his car behind. As the day goes by, circumstances conspire that give him opportunities to become more and more unhinged and violent as he makes his way on foot to his daughter's birthday. Even the conclusion of the movie fits in with modern Joker, but stay tuned on that front. William is a normal guy, just kind of on the angry side, who has one bad day that pushes him into a rampage. This idea of one bad day comes up with the Joker a few times, starting most famously with the Killing Joke story by Alan Moore. The cast Joker is a victim of bad circumstances, at least if you assume he's telling the truth about his own story, and pay attention to this one because that's a recurring theme here. The Dark Knight film continues this trend by giving Joker another multiple-choice past, split between one tale of his why so serious story, where he's a product of an abusive childhood, and another of his wife being in deep with the mob over gambling debts. The multiple stories make it more explicit he's lying, but the broad strokes are believable enough for producing a danger to society. It's after the society memes became a thing that you really start to see Joker media engage with the concept of the Joker as a product of society's ills. Jared Leto Joker wasn't around long enough one way or another, and thank the Allfather for that. But the Todd Phillips films are entirely fixated on this idea, especially the first one. The 2019 Joker movie isn't one bad day, but rather one rotten life, punctuated with a series of especially bad days before he goes flying down those steps to the totally coincidental tunes of Gary Glitter. It's a believable story because of how banal it is. Arthur Fleck is the adopted son of a woman suffering from delusions who negligently allowed him to be subjected to severe abuse at the hands of her boyfriends. Possibly the illegitimate son of Thomas Wayne, though I fall on the side that the mother was lying about that too. This abuse gave Joker his own set of psychological problems, though the films debate whether this goes to the level of full-tilt schizophrenia. Instead, he at least has borderline personality disorder and then his disruptive pseudo-bulbar disorder, the cause of his compulsive laughter. His disorders pushed other people away from him and drove his own mother's contempt for him. Contempt she was all too willing to share with others, even if not with Arthur himself. This bad life pushes him to mental illness, which is only barely cared for by an overworked and disinterested social worker from the city. She prescribes meds, which he says don't help him, and in the end she too is ripped away by budget cuts, leading him to go off his meds just before his descent into madness. The first movie pulls away everything that could have made Arthur a happy man or even just a stable one, then presents him with a few chances to vent his rage. First comes the shooting of the finance bros, which I would not say was entirely unjustified, except for definitely the last one who's just crawling away. The first ones would probably fall on the side of manslaughter or maybe one of the lower murder charges, as he was being assaulted by them after being harassed. It doesn't seem like the actions of an insane man, though it does match the actions of an unstable one given to swinging into a violent rage. The second murder, and this one is definitely a murder, is more on the side of insanity, where he brutally kills Randall, the man who had given him his gun and then lied about it, costing Arthur his job. He kills the man with an unnerving coldness compared to the fury before, and then seemingly is removed from the moment as he continues to treat Gary with kindness and to not quite understand what's bothering the poor man. Editing left below here, realizing I completely overlooked his murder of his mother, which is also cold and merciless, but is forgotten because the smothering seems like she died in her sleep. Mea culpa. It all culminates with his famous murder of Murray Franklin on live TV, this coming after his public debut as Joker in The Dance Down the Stairs. This one is the most premeditated, though he said his original plan was to turn his gun on himself, and instead his instability along with Murray's needling remarks caused him to again fly into a murderous rage. If there's ever a moment of real schizophrenia, it's probably right here, changing his plans on the fly into a grandiose kind of manic state, becoming a symbol for everyone who is as downtrodden as him, becoming somebody bigger and setting off a massive citywide riot.
I had some trouble with the law, got off on the insanity defense, told the state shrink, "I think you can get ahead in life by being a good person." She ran right back to the judge. Case dismissed.
So the 2019 movie fits in with the pattern of Joker as a product of society. When I talk about mental illness as a product of society, I mean two things: the materialist causes and the constructivist causes. The materialist causes of mental illness and society's history of calling disruptive or rebellious behavior mental illness, regardless of how it would be determined today. The materialist causes have less to do with my overall point here, but are still worth thinking about in Arthur's case. Per the North Carolina Medical Journal, a growing body of evidence indicates that poverty is highly comorbid with ACE exposure, and that children living in poverty are more likely than their peers to experience frequent and intense adversities. Such cumulative exposure to adversity causes stress that behaves as a toxin in the developing brain of a child. In the absence of protective factors, this toxic stress can change a child's neural architecture and result in emotional disorders and cognitive deficits. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, and the current science rates these as hugely influential for the development of mental and behavioral disorders later in life. The article I cited says that because poverty is so correlated with ACE exposures, it should basically be considered an ACE on its own. Mama Fleck's poverty was influenced by her mental illness, her poverty was passed on to her son, and his mental health suffered in turn. What I'd rather focus on is the constructivist cause of mental illness. It's pretty simple on the surface. A mental illness is whatever causes you to be unable to fully participate in society in a mental, social, or behavioral sense. This is reflected in medical science as much as social convention. The D at the end of OCD or ADHD stands for disorder. Being obsessive, compulsive, inattentive, or hyperactive are things that everyone experiences at times, but for some people it rises to the level of disorder based on prevailing social norms. Problem is, prevailing social norms in the past have included things like chattel slavery and the patriarchy. If you're an avid video essay viewer, you've probably heard about drapetomania, which was the alleged mental illness among some enslaved people that caused them to run away from their enslavement. Maybe you also heard about female hysteria, which wasn't just what we'd consider hysteria in common use today, which is commonly referred to like a panic attack or maybe a manic episode, but back in the day it encompassed basically anything a woman could do that was disruptive to the patriarchy. Too much sex drive? Hysteria. Not enough sex drive? Hysteria. Dissatisfied with your marriage? Etc., etc. These old debunked ideas on mental illness are what gives way to the modern movement called mad pride, which has been around since the 70s, itself an offshoot of the anti-psychiatry movement that's been around almost as long as psychiatry itself has been. The point of mad pride is to assert that different doesn't mean diseased. And at the more extreme end of the movement, they can maintain that all mental illness, as such, is a product of society, no different than judging a discontent housewife to be crazy and confining her to bed rest in the 1900s. This dovetails into the idea of the mentally ill person as a social outsider.
I want an outsider.
Perfect. There are several outside candidates that we think would be really...
No, I mean an outsider. Like someone on the margins of society who doesn't see things the way we do, like a homeless person.
Someone capable of bringing radical ideas to the table. In our society, political problems and solutions can seem obvious, but at the same time out of reach, where many politicians claim to be outsiders and yet find themselves equally unable to solve them. Same with the business world, where we're oversaturated with alleged innovators, but real change in the products and services we use remain elusive. So if the current crop of outsiders can't help us, you just look further and further outside, to the very fringes of society. Just find an outsider isn't just the domain of populist voters or Ryan the Temp, though. The fringes of human experience have been elevated as a possible source of guidance by famous philosophers of the 20th century. Frequent reference point of the channel Albert Camus cited those who evoked those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines, and said of those deserts of thought that the real effort is to stay there, rather, insofar that it is possible, and to examine closely the odd vegetation of those distant regions. A major philosophical work of the 70s explores the idea of mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, as a model for free thinking and anti-fascism. In 1972, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari jointly wrote Anti-Oedipus, where they hold up the schizophrenic experience as a kind of radical freedom that gets away from all of the totalities that are imposed on us by our sense of individual subjectivity. It's a hard read, and it took commentaries for me to really get what they were going for, including a solid YouTube video that I've linked in the description below. The two authors propose an alternative to psychoanalysis called schizoanalysis, saying the task of schizoanalysis is that of tirelessly taking apart egos and their presuppositions, liberating the pre-personal singularities they enclose and repress. A lot of $10 words in that statement, and that's the kind of book you're dealing with here. But they keep going back to a metaphor of humans as machines, not in the bad way of like being cold and unfeeling, but in the sense that like complex machines, we have many different parts that work together. They extend this metaphor to the human psyche, and those individual machine parts of the psyche, the so-called desiring machines, are what they see as being liberated in schizoanalysis and by the schizoid tendencies of the unconscious as a whole. They call a moment of self-liberation a schizophrenic breakthrough, as opposed to the asylum patient's schizophrenic breakdown. And they specifically highlight those breakthroughs as having revolutionary potential. Good people say that we must not flee, that escape is not good, that it isn't effective, and that one must work for reforms. But the revolutionary knows that escape is revolutionary. Withdrawal. Freaks. They conjure the same images of the deserts at the fringes of thought that Camus does, and often cite the same people. So there's a strong philosophical basis for the idea that revolutionary thought can look like insanity. In Deleuze and Guattari's case, the two might be one and the same. And so we come back to the Joker, and this is a video essay about the Joker, right? Yeah. And I do mean Joker and not the Joker. The 2019 movie is the one that best explores the idea of Joker as a revolutionary figure. Like I said before, he became a symbol even when nobody knew anything about him, when he was only a vague description of a murder suspect. And then Thomas Wayne mocked the protesters who arose after the killings by calling them clowns, and a whole kind of clownism movement was born. And then came his TV debut, and Gotham burst forth in a revolutionary fervor that led to Thomas Wayne's murder. For a brief, shining moment, Joker had overthrown Gotham City. Or had he?
Fool you once, shame on you. Fool you twice, Joker's trick.
While the final scene of Joker showed that he had been imprisoned, it still ended on an ambiguous high note, one that comes crashing down hard when we get to Folie à Deux. First, I'm going to get my Folie à Deux hot take out of the way. I think it was like 3 movies in a trench coat, kind of each of the core threads, if given its own movie, could have been a good movie. You have a rollicking musical rom-com, kind of superhero deconstruction, a focused courtroom procedural, or the deconstruction of both Joker as a character and the Joker-Harley relationship. Any of those could have been good movies on their own, but together we got what we got. But I want to pull on the deconstruction thread, which is also what FD Signifier and Jack Saint did in their videos that covered Le Joker 2. They both focused on the movie's attempt to hit the audience over the head with the fact that Arthur Fleck was not an enviable man in any capacity. But I want to look at Arthur Fleck as a victim. Of course, I'm not justifying what Arthur did in the course of the first movie. No, I'm talking about his victimhood after his arrest and how he's treated. I don't just mean, too, his abuse at the hands of the asylum guards, though that's a big part of it. Deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill wasn't just Reaganite cost-cutting people, but more how everyone around him takes advantage of him to try to use him for their own ends. His lawyer seems to have his best interest at heart, but that comes with a paternalistic attitude that ignores what he says he wants. She just wants him to win and get the best treatment, but is ignoring how he wants to get there. On the opposite end, Lee wants to push him into his worst tendencies just as a way to pursue her own delusional fantasies. All in all, the second film shows a more sobering look at mental illness, equally grounded compared to the first, but much more dour in sharpening the problems the mentally ill face, rather than the fantasies they can escape to. Lee's abuse of Arthur throughout the movie, including her sexual assault of him, fits a wider reality for the mentally ill, that they are more likely to be the victims of a crime than the perpetrators. The American Psychological Association cites that yes, mentally ill people are more likely than the general population to commit a violent crime, but it's a small difference. 2.9% of people with a serious mental illness had committed a violent crime compared to 0.8% overall in the period studied. Meanwhile, a different study from 2005 shows a much bigger gap in terms of the mentally ill being victims. About 17% of those with serious mental illnesses were a victim of violent crime in the year preceding that study, compared to just 4% of those without. Joker may have been powerful for a brief moment, but Arthur Fleck was a vulnerable, victimized man in society. And I would say, too, the first movie kind of does a disservice by cramming Batman's origin story in there. Sure, there's something poetic in a literary sense about Thomas Wayne being killed by the very people he had publicly scorned, but that kind of glazes over the fact that in reality, it's the most vulnerable people in society who suffer the most during a period of civil disorder. And you're not saying that all civil disorder is bad, that protest needs to be peaceful and non-disruptive, but of course, all riots and uprisings are not without cost to the most vulnerable. And that's all the more true if the riot has no aim or purpose like the one that started after Joker shot Murray Franklin. It's all cost, no upside. Even if Batman is a billionaire, he fights people like the Joker because their violence hurts innocent and vulnerable people, regardless of their other aims and the, somewhat higher motivations of villains like Poison Ivy. The best cinematic depiction of the Joker still remains Heath Ledger's from The Dark Knight, a film that gets criticism for being a 24-esque puff piece for the war on terror of the time. Batman violates everyone's privacy and breaks other boundaries because that's what it takes to get the job done. But along with being a compelling performance, it's also a truer interpretation of what Joker really stands for. Meanwhile, Joker in the film plays around with some ideas about society, such as his famous all part of the plan monologue where he points out that some lives are more valued than others. But I'd argue Joker comes off more as a reactionary force in that movie. He's initially hired by the Gotham gang leaders because they're desperate. As Alfred says,
"You crossed the line first, so you squeezed them, you hammered them to the point of desperation. And in their desperation, they turned to a man they didn't fully understand."
Powerful men got desperate, and Joker is an embodiment of their desperation. If they cannot rule, they will ruin. Joker is not ahead of the curve, he's behind it. The last thrashing tantrum of an old system, lashing out at something new in Batman and Harvey Dent. It's also the case in The Dark Knight that Joker is taking advantage of people with more serious mental illness than his own. The unfortunate man with a bomb sewn into his gut seems to be having a schizophrenic episode when he goes boom. While Joker's madness in that film is debatable as it is in most depictions, he definitely knows how to manipulate the seriously mentally ill. Now, funnily enough, there is one time where Joker becomes a force for political change, and that's in Season 3 of the HBO Max Harley Quinn cartoon, where he wins an election for mayor of Gotham. But this is part of a plotline where he lost his memories after nearly losing his life and got into a serious relationship with a nurse and mother. Even after he regained his Joker memories, the healthy relationship he'd formed with Bethany and her kids anchored him from going full supervillain again, setting his sights on a city crying out for relief from capes and crooks, crying out for some form of good government. Another editing left below addendum. One crucial part of the Mayor Joker subplot is that he manages to get Bruce Wayne put in jail for tax evasion. So when Joker puts aside his paranoiac cruelty and gives direction to his trademark weirdness, he manages to defeat Batman, and in a way that's good for society overall. Fitting that the parody cartoon is the one that took the edge off Joker and made him into an effective force for political change in-universe. His good turn doesn't last, but being a fairly recent story, it's a good coda to all the talk of Joker versus society. It turns out when he has some stake in society, a family he cares about, he can indeed use his Jokerness for political good. But at his most Joker, he isn't even an anti-hero. The catharsis at the end of The Dark Knight, when Batman breaks down any seeming point to Joker's crimes, is mirrored in other edgelord courting movies. At the end of Falling Down, William is confronted by the cop who's been chasing him all movie, and has a revelation.
I'm the bad guy?
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
Yes, we live in a society, one that has forces that can sharpen our mental anguish and turn it into mental illness, and then doesn't provide enough care for the mentally ill. But the real Joker's trick is manipulating others into thinking that the whole thing is just a sick joke and devolving into hurting people. Unorthodox thinking definitely has its place in changing the world, but there's a world of difference between keeping it weird and burning it all down for the lulz. Peace. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your favorite society meme. You can also follow me on Blue Sky.